Good afternoon, everybody. Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Welcome here. Welcome to this event. Very nice to see you all finally in presence after 2 years and a half. Last year, we met at the same date in the month of June. At that time, the title of the conference was Refocusing on Change. Speaking about NATO, of course. Because we were in the middle of a process of reform, considered to be useful after more than 50 and 70 years of existence. And the focus was especially on the political dimension, to be updated in order to be in tune with a changing security environment, how to adapt to emerging technologies, and how to enlarge the horizon to new partners in different parts of the world, and these things were high on the agenda. Today, we meet, unfortunately, in a different environment, because we are forced to take into account the tragic war unfolding in Ukraine after the Russian invasion of February 24. On the one hand, we feel the moral necessity to defend the aggressed. On the other, we hope that a negotiated solution can be found as soon as possible. But today, we would like to look at a larger horizon and not to concentrate on this issue, which is discussed every day at length. I would like to draw your attention on the fact that a new strategic concept of the alliance is adopted usually on average every 10, 12 years. And this will be the case next week in the Madrid summit, replacing the one decided in 2010 at the Lisbon summit. That text pointed at three clear priorities, which I think will be repeated: common defense, crisis management, cooperative security. We have not yet the complete language of the new concept, but it is clear that the war has an impact on the overall reflection concerning the reform process. A few things, however, can be said. We need to look at international security at 360 degrees, because security is global and has to be addressed projecting stability in all directions. Multilateralism is far from being obsolete. We see every day that we can confront emerging challenges of all kinds only if we are united. No country alone can do that. It is logical, of course, if you think about that, if you reflect about this, because today's challenges are all of a global nature. Climate change and security, high technologies, space affairs, artificial intelligence, resilience, a safe international order, health, cybersecurity, just to name a few of them, are all issues to be addressed together. And the alliance is there for that. We can also be comforted by the fact that was called the West. You know, some of you can remember this one. Well, this West is showing a cohesion that seemed to be lost a few years ago, and this is very good. And the positive fact is that the historic transatlantic bond has found new life, very energetic life, after some years of neglect. The alliance has already a high number of partners in different regions and in various ways, in different forms. But we have to take a fresh look at geography, to areas of growing importance, like Africa and the Sahel. And in this, of course, the Indo-Pacific is also becoming a natural area of mutual cooperation in the global landscape. Speaking from Rome, of course, it is impossible not to advocate the enhancement of partnerships in the South, the Mediterranean Dialogue, and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, signore e signori, the Foundation has done its best today to offer what we think is an interesting and perhaps also challenging program. As always, we promote a debate at high international level, in a scientific way, and in a spirit of reciprocal respect, which is very important, addressing problems of strategic relevance. In today's program, you have three lively panels on different subjects. The Honorable Fassino is opening debate. He is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Unfortunately, he was affected by COVID a few days ago. We are sorry for him, and so he will deliver his remarks from a remote. He is sorry, and we are all sorry. and the government of Italy is represented by the Undersecretary of State Della Vedova. We have collected today a high number of good speakers coming from various countries and looking at things from different angles. I thank them all, as well as the moderators. I owe special thanks to those who have supported us. First of all, Philip Morris International and la Fondazione della Compagnia di San Paolo, the college and the media partners, Air Press and Formiche. We are already traditional partners. The same goes, of course, all my thanks to the staff of the Foundation, a small staff doing an excellent work. Buon pomeriggio a tutti, and thank you for your attention. And I give the floor to General Rittiman, the commandant of the college.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure that I answer to the call of Ambassador Mito Doriso to provide some opening remarks to your very interesting conference. It cannot be more connected to the reality with such a title, A Relevant Alliance in a Changing World. As you might know, the NATO Defense College tries also to keep to the forefront of the challenges facing NATO. And one thing is sure, we do not lack such challenges. The war in Ukraine, even if one does not really understand the logic that pushed Putin to start it, is the culmination of tensions between Russia and the West, which started in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia, that many did not want to consider a turning point at that time, and of course the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Looking back, the current war justifies all the adaptation measures taken by NATO since then. Everything related to readiness, to enhanced forward presence, to new military strategy, to deterrence and defense, warfighting capstone concepts, to deal with the current crisis and to make sure that in the future we are armed to face a new crisis. But these were dissociated measures, very often empirical at their onset, and they need now to be integrated to an overall plan that covers the whole area of responsibility in the Euro-Atlantic area. And this is being done by Sakiro's team. But all this military literature needs now a political chapeau, and this is what is expected from the new strategic concept. One cannot yet speculate about the content of this document, which will be published in a couple of days now, but it will most likely insist on the protection of our common values, the reinforcement of the allied military means, the resilience of our societies, the acknowledgement of the global challenges, and the role of NATO as an institutional link between Europe and North America. NATO's Secretary General underlies that the alliance has never been as united as since the beginning of this war. This is undeniable, but this sacred union feeling should not let us forget NATO's capabilities gaps, in particular as far as European allies are concerned. And the alliance must therefore reinforce its determination to reach the target of the famous 2 and 20% by acquiring modern capabilities able to confront war in the future. And what is meant here is cyber, space, artificial intelligence, anti-hypersonic missile defense, autonomous drones, etc., etc. It's not about repairing old legacy equipment. Because let us not be abused, even if the Russian display is far from convincing, and even if it sheds light on significant gaps in matters of command and control, logistics, precision strikes, Russians will learn from their failures. And it would be a big mistake for the Europeans in particular to jump to the conclusion that the Russian threat is finally not so overwhelming as was thought before, and thus reduce their level of commitment. The alliance must therefore prepare for a war that will be much better conducted in the future, but must actually deter Russia from waging it. And this deterrence can no longer exclusively rest on American shoulders, because with the rise of China, the United States will inexorably turn their attention to the Indo-Pacific region. And even their resources are not unlimited. If the Europeans, whether in NATO or the EU, are not able to deter and possibly defend their own territory against a Russian threat, they will be defeated even before the fight. So the question of European strategic autonomy, I would rather say strategic responsibility, is therefore all the more actual. The Russian aggression will focus NATO's attention on the eastern flank, putting collective defense to the forefront. And the college is just back from a field study trip in Sweden and the 3 Baltic states, and I can tell you this is what they believe. This will come to the detriment of the 2 other core tasks, whether we want it or not: cooperative security and crisis management. They will certainly remain in the new strategic concept, but might encounter difficulties raising the interests of the Eastern allies. It is very clear that a crisis response operation of the magnitude of Afghanistan is not very likely in the foreseeable future. But even the southern flank partnerships, Istanbul Cooperation Initiative or the Mediterranean Dialogue, might suffer from the eastern flank exclusivity. And this will probably also be the case for the European Union missions, because it could be difficult to enroll Poles, Baltics, or Romanians, understandably so. Yet, the refocusing of NATO on its core mission of collective defense offers an opportunity for European defense. As a matter of fact, if the defense of Europe cannot be conceived, at least for the time being, outside of NATO, the European defense must take care of its southern flank, a zone of political and social instability, of mass immigration and illegal traffics, but also an area of natural resources and energy where Russians and Chinese roam freely without being contested. A European Union action in this southern flank would constitute a concrete translation of the cooperation with NATO by sharing the burden between the 2 organizations. To conclude, NATO must be able to count on the increased military capabilities of its European allies to alleviate the burden on the US shoulders. But at the same time, these European allies should not neglect the southern flank and could, via the EU, participate to the stabilization of the area and contest the penetration of our systemic rivals, because the Americans will not get involved there because they won't have the capabilities or the interest to do so. With that, I wish you a very fruitful conference, and I'm looking forward to reading the minutes, actually, of the conference. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, General, for your introductory remarks. You are the only person in uniform today, I think, but you do very well what you have to do. Now I have the pleasure to introduce the Honorable Piero Fassino, who is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Chamber of Deputies of Italy, and many of you know him. He unfortunately could not be here in person because, as I said before, unfortunately, he's isolated at home because of COVID influence, and I feel very sorry for him, and I hope for a very quick guarigione, as we say in Italian. The Honorable Fassino, who is listening to us, of course, is perhaps the politician that I know in my country the most interested in foreign affairs. And of course, for a person like me, this is very important. I mean, and probably also for you who are attending this conference. So without all the delays, I give you the floor, Honorable Fassino. A lei è benvenuto.
I would like to thank Ambassador Minuto Rizzo at the NATO Defense College for inviting me opening this seminar. I apologize that because of COVID, I cannot be here in person and must deliver these remarks online. We are meeting while Europe is confronting, we are meeting while Europe is confronting the war in Ukraine. And on the eve of the 2022 NATO summit in Madrid, on the 29th and the 20th of June, during which the Atlantic Alliance is set to adopt its new strategic concept. For over 70 years, NATO has been the political and military institution that has guaranteed the security of Europe and the West. The duration of this relationship shows that this alliance is not the fruit of short-term interest and contingencies, but instead reflects the shared liberal and democratic values that free society rests upon. Thanks to security granted by NATO, Western society have been able to build their prosperity upon these very values. Today, faced with a war that jeopardizes European security and stability, we can fully appreciate just how essential an institution NATO is and has been. And the decision of Sweden and Finland confirm this. The economic crisis between 2008 and 2015, 3 years of COVID, and now the war in Ukraine have given us a world that is far less secure. The pandemic, followed by the military threat and the subsequent energy crisis and the food emergency, comprise a unique series of events that must be tackled with resilience and foresight. The war itself showed that the depiction of NATO as an obsolete institution from a bygone era were rash and unfounded. Quite the contrary. Not only the European continent, but the world as a whole needs NATO, its having adeptness, its values, and its example. Without a determined and cohesive NATO supporting Ukraine, the country would not have made it. And NATO is an irreplaceable pillar of a transatlantic relationship between United States and European Union, which President Biden has significantly boosted. This is why we must see a different level of awareness and commitment on the part of the European allies. Significantly, after having long left security issues exclusively in the hands of sovereign member states, the European Union has now adopted the goal of adopting its own defense and security system, not as an alternative to NATO, but in a complementary fashion, in which Europe takes an increasing responsibilities and boosts its operational capabilities. In order to be effective, such a security system requires a European Union whose foreign policy is more assertive and effective. This is why we need everyone, Europeans and Americans, to step up. Europeans must be fully aware that security is a priority and take on all necessary responsibilities, including devoting 2% of GDP to defense. This is one of the major challenges we will face in the coming decades. European defense within the Atlantic Alliance, not as form of competition, but as cooperation. Looking at the nearby scenarios, there are 3 geopolitical areas where our security and stability strategies should focus. The first is Southeastern Europe. It is often said that the conflict in Ukraine is a war in the heart of Europe. This definition is accurate, but it should be nuanced. The war began in an area outside the border of the European Union, as did the wars in the Balkans and the Caucasus. The conclusion to be drawn from this is that integrating these regions into the European Union is an indifferable strategic goal to guarantee the security of the entire continent. This should be true for Ukraine and Moldova, but it must also hold true for the Western Balkans, which were promised integration into a Euro-Atlantic institution almost 30 years ago and are still waiting. As NATO opened its doors to Montenegro, Albania, and North Macedonia, the European Union has pursued enlargement at a snail pace, and this is no longer tolerable. This misalignment has exposed the Balkans to economic stagnation, emigration, a rise in nationalism, and new tension between countries that were at war just over 20 years ago. At the same time, new actors such as China and Russia have become more assertive there. It is time for the European Union to pick up the pace and bring to completion an enlargement process that has dragged on far too long. The second area is the Mediterranean. Here, crisis hotspots are arising worryingly fast. Tension between Greece and Turkey, a deteriorating situation in Lebanon, the frozen civil war in Syria, the general failure of the Arab Spring, the crisis in Libya, the instability in Tunisia, the tension between Morocco and Algeria over Western Sahara. And let us not forget the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has dragged on for over 70 years without a solution in sight. In recent years, the Mediterranean has suffered from international indifference and a lack of attention. And yet it should be clear that everything that happens in Mediterranean has a strong direct impact on the stability of Europe, the entire and vast region between Gibraltar and the Strait of Hormuz, and on the international equilibrium. It is time to put the Mediterranean once again as a priority item on the European, United States, and NATO agenda, combining deterrence and the dialogue to restore security and stability in the Mediterranean basin. Finally, we have the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. Here, civil war, constant coup d'etat, the presence of foreign armed groups and jihadist terrorists combine with the climate crisis to increase the risk of mass migration and consequent instability in the Mediterranean and Europe. And we must not forget that much like the Balkans and the Mediterranean, this region features a Russian presence that is all the more worrying in light of the war in Ukraine. In indicating these three geographic areas, it does not escape me that there are other scenarios equally strategic for international security and stability. Chinese expansionism into the Indo-Pacific region is a menace to stability, and not just in Asia. And of great significance is the alliance between NATO and AUKUS, a great alliance of the oceans in the service of open societies, democracies, and the rule of law. Equally strategic is the future of the Arctic Ice Pack, which, due to the consequences of climate change, is becoming an increasingly crucial hub for East and West relations. Finally, we must remember that armed conflicts are not the only risk to security and stability. Climate change is altering crucial conditions for human life. Poverty still affects great multitudes, triggering migratory flows that are changing the world's demographic profile. Digital technologies and artificial intelligence can be harnessed not only for the common good. Cybersecurity is an increasingly high priority in security strategies, and forms of hybrid warfare are arising. And the space is turning from a place of cooperation into a place of competition. In other words, there are multiple security dimensions facing the world. And this is true for NATO as well. In order to truly be a relevant alliance in a changing world, in addition to its military capabilities, it will have to develop an equally strong effective and pervasive political capacity. This is why the issues that will be discussed and approved at the Madrid summit, which will center the new strategic concept around the ability to combine military deterrence with political initiative, are extremely important. One supports the other. Without deterrence, political initiative is weak and powerless. Without political initiative, deterrence may risk becoming merely an armed rush. To stem the increase in insecurity and instability, we need both deterrence and dialogue, political capacity and military capabilities, technical skills and creativity. I am sure that the panels that follow will provide many important indications in this regard. In conclusion, to paraphrase President Kennedy, we must not hope for ourselves and for NATO to have tasks equal to our powers, but rather to have powers equal to our task. The world is asking us for stability and security, peace and development. We must be ready. And so let's roll up our sleeves. Let's begin now. Let's begin here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Onorevole Fassino. Grazie mille. It must be difficult for you to speak from home on such complicated issues with COVID, so we are very grateful for your remarks. Thank you very much. It's been very kind of you. Arrivederci. Guarisca presto.
Grazie. Grazie. Thank you very much. I follow the debate.
So now we can start the discussion, and I will introduce the first panel, which will be chaired by Frediano Finucci. I think you can come to the podium, and we are waiting for this very interesting subject that we're going to develop now.
As you like, don't worry. Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, General Ratement, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure today to introduce you the four distinguished panelists, the four distinguished speakers who have accepted today, in the following hours, to share their vision on the future of the NATO, which is the topic, the issue of this conference. Eric Terzuolo, welcome. Is a former American diplomat. He was assigned in Beirut, Rome, Prague, Paris, and The Hague. Once retired, he has taught in some important universities, and actually, he is professorial lecturer at the American University in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Benoît Daboville is currently Associate Fellow à la Fondazione pour la Recherche Stratégique and Associate Professor at Sciences Po. He's been the French ambassador in Prague, in Warsaw, and in Brussels, and overall, the French permanent representative at NATO from 2000 to 2005. So he has been in NATO headquarters in sensitive rooms in very hot moments in the first decade of this century. Matthias Dembinski, welcome, is a political scientist, senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. He's focused on regional security organizations and on European security. He's co-editor of the 2021 Friedrich Ebert Foundation study on 3 visions of NATO. Last but not least, General Vincenzo Camporini. Let me say, first of all, you have been a military pilot. I've made the research on the web. You have 2,600 hours of flights on 24 different planes and helicopters as well. But Mr. General, you are here today because you have been former Chief of Staff of the Italian Air Force and former Chief of Defense Staff. You have been President of the Center for High Defense Studies and actually Scientific Advisor for IAI, which is the Italian International Affairs Institute. So, dear guests, gentlemen, you know the rules. You have approximately 7 minutes each. Then we will have a very short Q&A session between me and you. And I give the floor to the gentlemen and to the ladies and gentlemen present today for questions. Mr. Eric Terzuolo, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today, and I think I can, on behalf of my fellow panelists, thank the NATO Defense College Foundation, also the NATO Defense College, the Fondazione, Compagnia San Paolo, and PMI International for organizing this timely initiative and making it possible. I think it's natural that in a situation of 3 summits, back to back to back, we start to think about the issue of the international division of labor. Natural enough, I think, though, it's, personally at least, I'm a little bit skeptical about our ability to a priori define the right rules and architectures for an international division of labor. If you just take the NATO-EU case, for example, we've really been working on these issues for about 30 years at this point and have made some significant, valuable steps, but it is time-consuming, it is labor-intensive, and perhaps also one might even debate the cost-benefits of things, although I do think this has been a worthwhile activity on the whole. Innovation is important. It's easy to talk about innovation. Innovation for its own sake can be a different matter, I would say, and I think there's a strong case to be made. I'm a little conservative, small c perhaps, on some of these issues. I think there's a strong case to be made for focusing on established core functions of organizations and entities and, you know, how to bring them up to date. It's not a static situation, but focusing on core functions, I think, has a lot of merits. I think we're seeing this to some extent in the current crisis, where if I've been reading a lot of communiques lately, and it's interesting to see how multiple international bodies seem to be falling into a natural, what I would call a natural division of labor, each playing to their respective strengths. And I think in a crisis situation, you do lead with your strengths. So that is good. Now, this said, we do need to think about the future. And I was looking at, for example, a very interesting European Union document, the Strategic Compass, that was released about 3 months ago. I think it has a lot of virtues in the sense that it does really a great job of cataloging a vast series of security threats and challenges that I say we in this kind of broad Western sense, but that we will be facing in the coming period. I think that, well, let's say I hope that the High Representative's argument that the Strategic Compass represents a kind of sea change in European Union approach toward a much more active policy on defense and security. I hope very much that this does play out as the High Representative is discussing it. I think the question we'll need to answer over time, or see answered over time, is to what extent the Strategic Compass can really offer us guidance and a clear sense of priorities going forward. It's interesting, Strategic Compass, I would note, stresses complementarity between the EU and NATO. And I think we really have to recognize, frankly, that the continued irreplaceable and central nature of NATO when it comes to dealing with the security challenges that we face in the Euro-Atlantic area and on the European continent. So my soundings in Washington before coming here suggest at least an official view that NATO is in fact adapting well to the new situation, to a changing situation, maintaining its focus on core functions, collective defense first and foremost, but also what more needs to be done, what new needs to be done to fulfill that core function. I would cite the great American humorist Mark Twain to say that reports of NATO's brain death were greatly exaggerated. It's shown a considerable adaptability, in fact. So we're now in a phase where we had a very interesting and important NATO summit in Brussels last year, notably taking cognizance of the China challenge in an incisive way that had never happened in a comparable way before within NATO. Obviously, for the upcoming Madrid summit, there are high expectations, particularly having to do with the new strategic concept. Again, my Washington sounding suggested a high degree of optimism about getting a good result on the strategic concept. If we had been talking maybe 6 months ago, the expectation for the new strategic concept might have been summed up in the 3 C's, China, cyber, and climate. Obviously, things have changed since then. There are people on the US side who advocate a new strategic concept based on the 3 R's, Russia, Russia, and Russia. That's not going to happen, though, and nor do I think it should happen. I think it's going to be a kind of Russia, China, and there has to be space, I think, a distinct rubric for the Russia-China relationship as well. So anyway, good degree of optimism in Washington on a positive result for the strategic concept. Optimism as well on the tricky issue, seemingly, of Finnish and Swedish membership in NATO. I think there's confidence that Erdogan's concerns can be addressed, in fact. I think it will also be interesting when the Finns and Swedes come in. It will be interesting to see how this affects sort of the balance between NATO and the EU when it comes to defense and security issues. I think it will have some effects.
You run out of time.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Rector Sol, for sharing your vision on the future of NATO. Now it's up to Ambassador Benoit Daboville. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you mentioned that we are speaking about the future of NATO, but the future of NATO is now, because we cannot fail on Ukraine, as we have failed in Afghanistan. So far, the Ukrainian crisis has brought an unprecedented cooperation between the EU and NATO on sanctions, of course, but also in sending arms. And for the first time, the EU has mutualized the funding of sending arms by European countries. On the strategic concept and on the EU compass, there is no much difference. The only difference, and we can go back to that, is about China. And I am not so optimistic as Chairman Fassino. Now, there is a certain ambiguity about the ultimate Western goal in Ukraine. We are all united about helping Ukraine to resist the naked aggression. And it is up for the Ukrainian to decide what kind of ceasefire or compromise or no compromise they want. It is not for us to say it. However, there is a difference of vision about what we are seeking. Some, especially in Washington and in London, are looking about defeating Russia, but not only defeating, but also preventing a defeated Russia to rise again and to be, in a way, to be defanged. No longer a problem. Now, some people are more realistic, and they think that we want to, Ukrainians, decide on 3 things. Their territorial integrity, the guarantee they get from the international community, and also the kind of rebuilding they will get from the international community, because they are destroyed just now. And probably the EU will fund quite a lot. Now, it is important that we don't consider that Ukraine is a proxy war for us. The people who are dying now are the Ukrainians. And now, what are the consequences on the international situation? Of course, UN is brain deaf. It can resurrect like NATO, but for the time being, it's absolutely unable to do anything, including on the food crisis. Probably we will not get, for the year to come, Russian cooperation on non-proliferation on Iran and North Korea. And we have quite a problem also on the way our policy to help Ukraine has taken by part of the world. Half of the 35 countries, among the most populous, including China and India, are not following us on Ukraine. They are not making a new bloc of non-aligned. They have different reasons not to follow us. However, it is also a sign that they are trying to take into account the fact that we have been rather imprudent to use armed forces against other countries. And they remind that. It is not against colonialism and so forth. They are, for the time being, not following us. And this is an element which will wear. Now, there's a further aspect, which is that nuclear deterrence still play a key role on managing adversary relationship. President Biden has been very careful from the start to not to involve NATO and the US. And Moscow, despite the threat, is not for the time being attacking NATO first. So nuclear deterrence is an important factor, and I think that the strategic concept will say it again. Then the last point I want to stress is that we have to rebuild Ukraine. When, I don't know, but it will be quite costly and it's very important. The fact that we have said to the Ukrainians that we are ready to adopt their candidacy, and it will take some time to negotiate, but nevertheless, they are even more now in Europe than they were already since 2018. And, but let's be clear, we know that it will have an unavoidable effect on the situation of the other candidates in the Balkans, Georgia, Moldova. And so the 39 states of the new framework of European Union will have to be built. And it will be very difficult. It will be change the weight and the balance of power within EU, the way EU is functioning, and so on. At the same time, NATO is also will change its internal balance. Of course, now we have a free front state, Poland, the Balts, and Romania, and we have been sending 1,000 troops just now in Romania for at least 5 years, and therefore it will be important for the cohesion of NATO that, as Chairman Fassino said, that they don't look only on the East, but they consider that the threat against Europe are coming from all sides.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your picture. Now let's switch from France to Germany. Dr. Dembski, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Now, I've been tasked to, and I quote, rethink a Euro-Atlantic security architecture among various options. And being a political scientist with an interest in institutional theory, I find this rather intriguing. I mean, obviously, the Euro-Atlantic security order is in a state of flux. And open questions concern the character of this order itself, how Ukraine's security will be guaranteed, NATO's place within this order, the role of the United States within NATO, and NATO's institutional setup. Now, a lot of things, of course, will depend on how Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine will end. Now, if we assume, and I think right now this seems to be the most realistic scenario, so if we assume that the war simmers on, or that it ends with a kind of a dirty compromise, and that Putinism continues to reign in Moscow, it seems likely that A, the security order will be rather antagonistic, and B, that NATO will regain its preeminent place among Europe's foreign and security institutions, and that C, that among the NATO's core tasks, collective defense will be a kind of primus inter parens, as a recent NATO report has put it, and D, that the United States will remain committed, at least to some extent, to European security and defense. And this also holds in case Donald Trump or someone like him is elected in 2024. However, the American presence, and has been mentioned already, the American presence and the tension will shift to the Pacific. In other words, everything changes except NATO's institutional setup. NATO will occupy the center of the European security stage, but the alliance will be hindered by those institutional and political shortcomings that have been discussed widely in recent years and that have culminated in Macron's diagnosis of the alliance as brain dead. Now, being an intergovernmental organization, of course, NATO suffers from the typical weaknesses of such organizations. The consensus principle, in combination with the growing membership and increasing heterogeneity of interests and outlooks, often impedes rapid decision-making and effective responses to external challenges. I mean, NATO may be institutionally better suited than other organizations to function effectively. However, differences between Turkey and other member states in particular have made effective decision-making sometimes rather difficult, to put it mildly. In the past, the United States' hegemonic position and leadership role has exerted a kind of a disciplining effect and has helped to overcome institutional blockages. Now, during Trump's tenure, the American leadership role waned, inter-alliance conflicts culminated, and others tried to step in, however, with only limited success. Now, in the future, the shift of America's attention away from Europe calls for other responses, and I will briefly mention some. Institutional theory has identified 3 avenues towards more effectiveness, namely the introduction of majoritarian decision-making, delegation of authority to supranational bureaucracies, and reduction or manipulation of the membership and of core tasks. In NATO, the first avenue remains blocked for good reasons. The reflection report, also known under the official title NATO 2030 United for a New Era, proposes only slight institutional changes that aim only at a more effective implementation of consensual decisions. The second avenue has limits as well. In NATO, the Secretary General is still more secretary than general. He possesses agenda-setting powers, but he cannot coerce and not even nudge member states to do something that they do not want to do. And here, the reflection report proposes to increase the delegated authority of the Secretary General, but the report restricts this recommendation to the area of his or her managerial tasks. I'm out of time?
No, you still have 2 minutes more.
Okay. The third avenue offers some potential, and the new emphasis on collective defense will strengthen cohesion anyway. However, it will not with regard to the other core tasks, and especially with regard to crisis management, the same effect is rather unlikely. And the question here then is whether a change of membership, especially whether the introduction of formalized or informal subgroups may add to NATO's effectiveness. One example of such a flexible ad hoc arrangement was the use of NATO's command structure by a coalition of NATO states that had intervened in the war in Libya in 2011. NATO's framework nation concept is another example of a more formalized subgroup concept. The reflection report too mentions the establishment of coalitions inside of NATO, inside of the existing alliance structures as a way to achieve more effectiveness, and it also outlines some conditions for the working of such subgroups to alleviate the risks that obviously go hand in hand with the establishment of such institutionalized subgroups. But nevertheless, I think that this avenue offers some potential and that we should think more about that. To summarize, member states expect NATO to play a pivotal role, and in light of a reduced American leadership role, and in order to be able to live up to these expectations, NATO might want to explore the opportunities of more flexibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Dembinski. General Camporini, you have the honor to close this first round.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation. And I would like to say something about the military side of the issue, because politically I think that we have a large consensus on the things to do and maybe not on how to do the things. But the point is that if we have a political consensus, we need to have also the instrument to make it work. And we have to ask ourselves whether the instrument we have is properly structured. I recall in 2010, 2011, when there was a drawdown on the command structure of NATO. It was a very delicate moment. Decisions were taken, which at the time I was Chief of Defense. I was not very happy about what was taken as a decision. At that time, the password was, we have to spare. We have to spare money. We have to spare manpower. And we drew down our command structure from 18,000 to 9,000, roughly. We have that. Of course, the world was looking in a good health. There was no need to have big muscles, so that was the decision taken. Although on the military side, as I said, not very many were happy. A few years later, things started to change a little bit, and of course, the attitude of Russia was one of the elements, but not the only one. And the decision was taken to restructure the command structure of NATO. I was part of the senior expert group, which was to advise the two supreme commanders who were supposed to offer the solution, to offer the proposals. It was a very interesting moment, and we had to work a little bit because since the two strategic commanders were given the responsibility to offer the proposals, they started in a separate way, and the danger was that each commander was offering the council each own solution, which was, of course, incompatible with the other. But eventually, we succeeded in putting them together, and the decision was taken to strengthen and to rearrange the command structure. Was it the proper thing to do? I think so, because at that time we were trying to fulfill the concept laid down in Warsaw, the NATO at 360 degrees, which had been lost. and the awareness that we needed to be in a position to offer the military power in the North Arctic, in the Atlantic, to protect the lines of communication from the American continent to the European continent, to the south, because we realized that we could have some problems in the south, as we had experienced during the unfamous Arab Springs, and of course to the east. So 360 degrees required a different structure of command, which was in a way done, of course, with not everybody was totally happy, but the solution which we had is, in principle, a good one. In principle, because, of course, once you lay down a plan, then you must fulfill the plan, and fulfilling the plan means finding the right people to send to the right places, which is not the easiest thing to do. But I think that this portion of the problem has been, in a way, taken care of. But this is not the only portion of the military problem we have. One big portion is the capability to operate together. And here we have some difficulties. We have some difficulties because since the times of the Cold War, we really lost the concept of interoperability, the loss of compatibility of forces. Although we were fighting together in Afghanistan and in other places, but each country was extremely jealous in developing its own piece of equipment. Of course, this is quite reasonable because each one has to take care of jobs, of technology capabilities, technology base, and so on and so forth. But the final result is that each country is operating its own piece of equipment, almost, with the two effects. First of all, the cost. Everybody's been talking about the need to go to 2% the GDP spending for each country. This is senseless if we do not spend this money wisely. And since we have so many different pieces of equipment for the same job in Europe, each piece of equipment costs at least 3 times what it should cost if we were able to combine requirements and produce together the piece of equipment. So it's a problem of cost. And again, it's not something which can be done only at the expenses of jobs in a single country, because we can reasonably make agreements in producing together the same piece of equipment. So it's a problem of cost, not only of cost. It's a problem also of operational capability. And I will give you my last thought with the experience we are having now in Ukraine. We are providing weapons to Ukraine. The weapons are coming from different countries of different types. They require different training. How much time does this cost the Ukrainians to learn 3, 4 different types of heavy artillery? I think that this is the main issue we have to face, and we should be quite concerned about these issues. If we are aware of these issues, we can find a solution, which I believe it's something we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, General Camporini. So, gentlemen, we have more or less 10 minutes for a very short question for each of you, and then we will give the floor to the Q&A session. Mr. Terzuolo, in the latest days, we had a phone conversation preparing this event, and you told me, you told me, I don't like the word strategic compass. I'd prefer strategic GPS, maybe Galileo, considering we are in Europe. Why?
Good point. Yeah, I think to some extent, and as I said, I think there are a lot of good things about the Strategic Compass document, first and foremost. I think the problem is the metaphor of the compass, in a way, because if you think about it, it arrays, in essence, a whole series of important questions, each individually important, around the compass, around the 360 degrees of the compass. They are all equidistant from the center of the compass, given the nature of the structure of the tool, and there's only one needle, let's say, on the compass. We probably would need more, because we probably have to be able to, as we say in the US, walk and chew gum at the same time. There's probably more than one thing we're going to need to do at any given time. But more concerning to me, and I think to other commentators who've looked at it, is how is it determined how the needle points? You have a wide range of possible concerns, all rightly identified. How do we set the priority? How do we make decisions? And so I think it's, you know, and that's a question to be dealt with over time. So it's just, in a way, the metaphor and the design that doesn't convince me very well. But perhaps Ambassador Daboville has a different view.
Would you like to add something, Ambassador?
I totally disagree. Of course, you can also say that you need a compass when you are in the fog, and therefore you don't need a compass in clear time. No, the problem is the compass was an exercise between the Europeans to try to define what they are willing to do for the common security. And we achieved that, and it is compatible to NATO strategic compass. Strategic concept. Now, I will take issue about the subgroup idea. I didn't like at all the report of the Secretary General. I think it was a mismatch, it was bureaucratic, it was trying to get more money to the civil servant in NATO and so forth. But the idea of a subgroup is, in my view, totally contrary to the essence of NATO. That means that some countries don't share the concern of other country, other part of the alliance. That means that you destroy the common feeling that you are in a common alliance. That means that Italy will not be interested in the Arctic, that France will not be interested in Poland, that I think it is the most destroying concept which has been mentioned by the Secretary General.
You spoiled my question. Okay, Mr. Nembinski, you mentioned the possibility of having enhanced cooperation within NATO members, which is something that still exists in the European Union treaties. For example, we know that the single currency is an enhanced cooperation itself. Don't you think, as the ambassador said, that there could be the risk to have a kind of NATO à la carte? You're a member of a club, and each time you decide you are partners in a different game.
I mean, in an ideal world, of course, we would agree on everything. In an ideal world, there would be solidarity on everything. However, we are not living in an ideal world. We are confronted, or NATO is confronted, with a typical institutional problem that all institutions face, at least as if they grow in membership, and if they take on additional tasks. It becomes more and more difficult to create a common outlook. As I said in my talk, NATO is actually rather good in doing that because of this consultation culture, basically, and because almost all states are democracies. And democracies among each other are really able to find common ground, or are better suited to find common ground than other states. However, this does not solve the problem that we face. Yeah? Time and again, we came up with very different, or states came up with very different outlooks. And the question is then, what do you do? If you can't agree, is the solution not to act at all? Probably not. And I mean, I think that the experience of Libya in 2011, at least for me, that was a kind of an eye-opener. And I fear that scenarios like this might also come up in the future, and that we have to handle it somehow. And in 2011, this was handled in, I would say, in a very, very good way.
General Camporini, I think that the ambassador would like to add something before giving.
I think there are only two ways to decide in an international organization. One is consensus, and one is majority or qualified majority. Consensus, I have practiced that in NATO, is forcing the meeting of mind. Sometimes it doesn't work. Okay, but that is the value of consensus. Erdogan is playing consensus. And say, okay, he won't object, and then he will rally, but he will have the pressure of everybody. Now, if you have a qualified majority, that means what? What do you do with the US? Do you give a majority share from the start? Or do you put them on a minority? No, it doesn't have sense.
General Camporini, assuming that the current and future threats come from East, as we know very well in these months, do you think it would be better to have a future Secretary General, a man or a woman from a country with borders, or with Russia, or without?
Iceland. Recent history has told us that we had several Secretary Generals from the North, and my initial reaction...
From the North, watching from Italy.
My initial reaction would be, now the next one should come from the South. South can be Spain, can be France, can be Italy, can be Greece. I don't think it can be Turkey, but
that's another job.
But I believe that what we need is someone, man or woman, with a broader view, with a broader experience, with the understanding that a threat is not coming from one side. A threat is the composition of challenges coming from all over, which was clearly stated again in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Summit. 360 degrees does not mean that the threat may come from different locations. Means that the challenges are the composition of several threats. Because now we are facing the military challenge in Ukraine, but we know quite well that what may happen in the northern shore of Mediterranean due to the shortage of grain caused by the war will augment and multiply the threat for our countries, which is not only a military threat. I am a supporter of controlled immigration, but if immigration is not controlled, it becomes a disaster for those who come and for us who receive. So, a Secretary General who has the full understanding that we are not only facing something from one side, and we are facing something which is the composition of different components which make the total threat.
Thank you, General Camporini. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's up to you. We have two terrific microphones. So please raise your hands if it's possible for you to go there. And to make your question, please identify yourself. Short questions, short answers.
Thank you very much for allowing me to ask the question. My name is Nasser al-Baluchi. I am the ambassador of Bahrain in Italy. My question is that why Russian war in Ukraine is continuing without a solution? and we know very well that the Europeans are suffering from the economic sanctions as well as the Russians. What can NATO, my question, what can NATO do to suppress the prolongation or the continuation of this war, and to prevent any possibility of its expansion? Thank you very much.
I think we can collect 2 questions if there are any or some more. Alessandro Politi.
Thank you. Alessandro Politi, the director of the foundation. As we have seen, Ukraine pulled a quite interesting feat in defensive. Now, this defensive has its own limits, we show it. But surely, Europe already alone spends 4 times the Russian defense budget. And this is already implicitly a way on how division of, I would say, capabilities and tasks can be made. Of course, the alliance has everybody in, including Northern American allies for very important capabilities, but the Europeans already could provide a good bulk of the defense of that sort of border. Probably not an extended border, but at least the present one of NATO. Thank you.
So 2 tough questions. Who would like to start? Ambassador?
I think one has to remind that during the first period of the Ukrainian war, the issue was about Soviet-made equipment on one side and Soviet-made equipment on the other side. And we were, in fact, Poland or Czech Republic were just unstocking and sending to Ukraine, which was a good opportunity. Now we have, as General Camporini said, that we are in a new phase where you have to bring new material, which will need training and so forth, and also. But the problem is that the war is evolving from a dynamic war. We are now in a static war, a war of artillery, or trenches, and so forth. And by November or December, each side will have depleted capacity. And at that time, there will be the question whether the Ukrainians try to negotiate something or they don't want to negotiate. They are supposed to have a referendum on the term of the ceasefire. So,
which is not very easy.
Which will be not very easy, but I think that the country is suffering so much that there will be a fatigue. There will be also a fatigue in the West. Don't kid ourselves. You just look at the polls in Italy or in France or in Germany and so forth. So therefore, we will have a very trying time quite soon, in a few months, 6 months at most. And at that time, also we will have, we had an election in the US, which probably will be bad for Biden. Therefore, that will has also an impact on the context. Maybe, but that time Putin will be ill or will be removed. So we are in a time frame which we cannot really envision clear direction.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we still have the first question unanswered. You will.
I will take that on.
Thank you.
And I think the thing that we need to remember, I think there's a tendency to look for the deus ex machina, the authority, the national capital, the organization that will solve the problem, that will put an end to the war. And what we need to remember is that we are assisting Ukraine. We are assisting Ukraine to preserve its sovereignty. And as President Biden constantly says, no decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine. So NATO does not have the magic, alas, that we did. We had the magic button, we press it, we get a good solution. The Ukrainians will have to decide what they are prepared to accept, what they regard as an acceptable peace. And in that, they're going to certainly be taking into account what NATO is doing in their support, what the individual NATO allies and other friendly countries are doing in their support. They have to assess their own sustainability in the face of this war. But ultimately, the decision rests in Kyiv, and hopefully they will understand, I'm sure they will understand realistically what it is that they can sort of count on, as it were, from us and what not. So no decisions on Ukraine without Ukraine. Don't deny Ukraine's agency. And that was, I'm sure, not your intention, but often the discussions sort of tend to deny the agency of the Ukrainians in this and put it in a few great power capitals, for example.
So we still have 5 minutes more. Any other questions from the floor or from the web? Okay, we have two questions coming from, I don't know, from social media or from the web. What can be the future relationship between NATO and the United Nations? And the second question is concerning human rights. What can be NATO's political contribution? Gentlemen.
I think the issue of relationship between NATO and the UN is not problematic. There is already existing links, consultation, visit. The Secretary General is keen for its own publicity to go to the General Assembly. So this is not a problem. Each organization has its way to work. The UN has the Security Council, which is blocked now by China and Russia, and NATO has the consensus rule. So there's I don't see any problem about that. One problem is when NATO is acting militarily without respecting the rule of the UN, as in Iraq, and also as in Kosovo. And you can see that Putin is again speaking all the time about the Kosovo.
About those events. Dr. Dembski.
Should I put the first question or the second one? Address
As you like. I think that they can, okay.
Okay,
first question about the relationship, and the second is about human rights.
Just one brief remark concerning the first question. I think it's still interesting to remember when NATO started to transform itself in the early 1990s and to take on out-of-area operations and not only focus on crisis management operations. NATO portrayed itself as a kind of a subcontractor of the United Nations. And this concept was somehow then lost for a couple of reasons. But it would be, I think, interesting to go back to that and really to offer NATO's capabilities in this business of peacekeeping. It might be difficult to get the political support for that, and there is of course a lot of mistrust within the world community regarding the role of NATO, but still to present this offer I think would be a step in the right direction.
General Camparini, final remarks.
Yes, this question about relationship between NATO and the UN, I recall 1997, we were discussing about the Balkan crisis, and I was a young brigadier general and participated in the NATO Defense College in a debate and made this consideration. Why don't we establish a memorandum of understanding between UN and NATO? And NATO becomes, as you alluded, the strong arm of the United Nations. At the time, it seemed to be possible because we had, in a way, a path of convergence between Russia and the rest of the alliance. I don't think this is possible any longer. I'm afraid that NATO is still in good health. I cannot say the same thing about the UN. The structure of the UN is such that decision-making is almost impossible. A very useful organization to provide humanitarian support, food support, cultural support, but not something which can be of a larger use, unfortunately. I'm very, very sorry to say that, for destabilization of conflicts. So I am afraid that it was a good question. It is no longer a good question.
General Compagnia, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dembinski. Thank you, Ambassador Daboville. Thank you, Dr. Terzuolo. Thank you for listening us. And now it's time for a coffee break. Half an hour at 4:30. Please stay in the room so my colleague will start the next panel. Thank you.